I spent 5 hours on these braids and 3 weeks' salary on this deep maroon dress just to die in the back of a car that wasn't even mine. I thought it was my ride home from the gala. I was wrong. The moment the child's safety locks engaged with a heavy thud, I realized I hadn't just entered a luxury sedan, I had entered a war zone. The man behind the wheel didn't look like an Uber driver. He looked like an executioner. And he only said 4 words. "You're not leaving, Imani."
Imani Johnson stepped into the black sedan at 12:05 a.m., her mind still reeling from another night of being the perfect invisible employee at the firm. In exactly 45 seconds, the $200,000 car would become a target for a hail of semi-automatic fire. In exactly 2 hours, she would be trapped inside a fortress-like estate, staring into the cold, dark eyes of Ji-hoon Park, the most feared name in the city's underworld. But she didn't know any of that yet. Right now, she was just a woman with a dead phone and a broken heart, trying to rub the ache out of her feet after a night of playing pretend. "One night," she whispered to the cold glass of the window. "I just wanted one night where I didn't have to be the responsible one." She had spent her whole life following the blueprints others drew for her, meticulous, safe, boring. She thought she was being forgotten by the world, but as the car lurched forward and the driver's grip tightened on the wheel, Imani was about to find out that being noticed by the wrong person is much more dangerous than being invisible.
The hum of the city faded into a muffled, expensive silence the moment Imani pulled the heavy door shut. The interior of the sedan smelled like sandalwood, aged leather, and a hint of something metallic, not the usual scent of air fresheners and stale coffee. She didn't look at the driver immediately. She was too busy wrestling with the strap of her beaded clutch, her fingers fumbling as she tried to shove her dead phone inside. "Finally," she exhaled, the sound of her own voice feeling too loud in the plush cabin. For 3 hours, she had been Imani the architect, the woman with the perfect smile and the sharper blueprints, nodding as partners at the firm spoke over her as if she were part of the office furniture. Her feet throbbed in her heels, and the deep maroon fabric of her dress felt like a beautiful, restrictive armor she couldn't wait to shed. She expected the driver to start the trip on his GPS. She expected a polite hello or a grunt of acknowledgement. Instead, there was only the sound of a heavy electronic thud. Imani's eyes snapped open. Her hand instinctively went to the door handle, pulling it once, then twice. It didn't budge. The child's safety locks had been engaged from the front console.
"Wait, I think there's a mistake with the door," she said, her heart giving a strange, erratic thump against her ribs. She looked up, her gaze meeting the rearview mirror. 2 dark, piercing eyes were watching her. They weren't looking at the road, they were focused entirely on her reflection. The man behind the wheel was East Asian, his hair slicked back with military precision, his expression as unreadable as a stone wall. He didn't look like he was following a map. He looked like he was waiting for a signal. "Unlock the door, please," Imani said, her voice rising an octave, the perfect girl veneer beginning to crack. "I think I got into the wrong car. I'm looking for a silver Prius." The driver didn't turn around. His hands, clad in black leather gloves, tightened on the steering wheel until the material creaked. "The Prius is 2 blocks away, Imani," he said. The air left her lungs. His voice was a low, smooth vibration that seemed to coat the inside of the car. It wasn't the voice of a stranger. It was the voice of someone who had been watching her. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, her wide eyes searching his face in the mirror for any sign of a joke. "I know your name, I know your firm, and I know exactly which floor you live on," he replied, finally shifting the car into gear. The engine roared to life, a powerful, predatory growl. "You're in the wrong car, Imani Johnson, but tonight it's the only one that's going to keep you alive." As the sedan surged forward into the dark, Imani realized with a jolt of terror that the ride home she had been praying for was over. Her life was no longer following the blueprints. The sedan didn't just drive, it sliced through the city streets with a terrifying mechanical intent. Imani gripped her clutch so hard the sequins bit into her palms. She watched the speedometer climb, 80, 90, 100, as the city lights blurred into long neon streaks against the rain-slicked pavement.
"If this is a kidnapping, you're doing it wrong," Imani choked out, her voice trembling as she braced her hand against the dashboard. "You're going to kill us both." Ji-hoon didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the side mirror. "I'm not the one trying to kill you, Imani. Look back." She twisted in her seat, her beaded braids whipping against her shoulders. Two dark SUVs had swerved out from a side street, their headlights cutting through the dark like predatory eyes. A sudden, metallic clink echoed through the cabin as Ji-hoon reached into the center console, pulling out a sleek, matte black handgun with practiced ease. "Get in the driver's seat," he commanded, his voice as steady as if he were ordering a drink. "What? No, I can't."
Now! He didn't wait for her consent. He shoved the gear into a temporary cruise and shifted his weight, forcing his body toward the passenger side. Panic surged through her, hot and blinding. Imani scrambled over the center console, her maroon gown bunching around her thighs, her heels catching on the leather. She slammed into the driver's seat, her hands shaking so violently she could barely feel the cold circle of the steering wheel. The moment she took control, a deafening crack shattered the rear window. Glass sprayed across the interior like diamonds. "Drive!" Ji-hoon roared. He had rolled down the passenger window, leaning out into the freezing wind. Imani floored the accelerator. The car fishtailed as they hit the Brooklyn Bridge, the steel cables flashing past like the ribs of a giant beast. Behind them, the SUVs gained ground. More gunshots erupted, the sound echoing off the bridge's structure like thunder. "Keep it steady," Ji-hoon yelled over the roar of the wind. He returned fire, the muzzle flashes illuminating his face, intense, focused, and dangerously calm.
Imani's world narrowed down to the yellow lines on the asphalt and the scream of the tires. The perfect girl who never got a parking ticket was now weaving through traffic at triple the speed limit, dodging commuters who honked in oblivious terror. She saw a gap between two semi-trucks and steered into it, the sedan grazing a guardrail with a screech of metal on metal. For a second, the SUVs were blocked. Ji-hoon pulled himself back inside, his shirt torn at the shoulder, his eyes locking onto hers. There was a flicker of something new in his gaze, not just cold calculation, but a grim respect. "You're doing better than the Prius driver would have," he muttered, slamming a fresh magazine into his weapon. Imani didn't answer. She couldn't. She just gripped the wheel and kept driving, the girl she used to be disappearing in the rearview mirror along with the smoke of the gunfight. The screech of tires on gravel was the only sound that broke the oppressive silence as the battered sedan swept through a set of towering iron gates. The bridge was miles behind them, but the scent of gunpowder still clung to Imani's hair, mixing with the cold night air that rushed through the shattered rear window. As the car slowed, a fortress of limestone and glass rose out of the darkness. Ji-hoon's estate. It was a masterpiece of modern architecture, all sharp angles and cold lighting. But to Imani, it looked like a tomb. Ji-hoon stepped out before the car had fully stopped, his movements fluid despite the blood staining his sleeve. He didn't offer to help her, he simply stood by the door, waiting. Imani emerged trembling, her maroon dress torn at the hem and her beaded braids messy with glass dust. She felt small beneath the shadow of the house, a fragile porcelain figure caught in a world of steel.
"Inside," was all he said. The foyer was vast, echoing with the click of her broken heels. But they weren't alone. Waiting in the center of the hall were three men, their presence casting long, jagged shadows across the marble floor.
These were the elders of the Park Syndicate, men with silver hair and eyes that had seen decades of blood. They didn't look at Ji-hoon with concern. They looked at Imani with a clinical, deadly detachment. "You brought a witness into the inner sanctum, Ji-hoon," the eldest whispered, his voice like dry parchment. He stepped forward, his gaze raking over Imani's evening finery, as if she were a stain on the floor. "The girl is a liability. She has seen the face of the Valente hit squad. She has seen the route to this house." "She's the reason the car stayed on the road," Ji-hoon countered, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. He stepped slightly in front of her, a gesture that was less about protection and more about ownership. The elder shook his head slowly. "A designer, a civilian. She is a variable we cannot afford in the middle of a war. There are ways to handle these things quietly, before the sun rises." The air in the room turned arctic. Imani's breath hitched in her throat. She was used to being ignored in boardrooms, but she had never been discussed as a problem to be removed. She looked at the sharp lines of the house, her architect's mind instinctively tracing the security cameras and the thickness of the reinforced glass. She was trapped in a cage of the highest quality, and the men holding the keys were already deciding her expiration date. Ji-hoon's hand tightened on the back of a nearby chair, his knuckles white. "She stays under my watch. If any of you move against her, you move against me. Then you are choosing a very beautiful way to fall," the elder replied, turning his back on them. As they were led away, Imani realized that the bridge ambush was only the beginning. She wasn't just a guest or a prisoner. She was a target in a house where even the walls felt like they were closing in to crush her. The silence of the estate was worse than the gunfire. It was the heavy, suffocating silence of a tomb waiting for its occupant. Imani sat at a massive mahogany desk in a room that felt more like a command center than a library, her eyes burning from the glow of the digital blueprints spread across the monitors. Ji-hoon stood by the window, his silhouette a jagged line against the moonlit grounds. He hadn't spoken since the elders left, but the tension radiating from him was a physical weight. Imani forced her trembling hands to move across the touchscreen interface. Her architect's mind, trained to find the soul of a structure, began to pull apart the house's defenses. The Park estate was a marvel of engineering, reinforced concrete, biometric sensors, and overlapping fields of fire. But as she peeled back the layers of the HVAC systems and structural load bearings, she saw it. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the air conditioning raced down her spine. "The elders are right," she said, her voice cracking the silence. "I am a variable you can't afford." Ji-hoon turned slowly, his eyes dark and unreadable. "I already told them you're under my protection. Don't make me regret it by sounding like them." "No," Imani said, standing up, the silk of her ruined dress whispering against the chair. "You're protecting a house that's already been sabotaged. You think you're in a fortress, but you're living in a kill box." Ji-hoon walked toward the desk, his gaze dropping to the screen. "Explain." "This development project, the one your syndicate just finished," she said, her finger tracing a ventilation shaft that bypassed the primary security hub. "The structural blueprints were altered. If someone knows the frequency of these reinforced glass panels, they don't need a bomb to get in. They just need a harmonic pulse. And this shaft? It's not for air. It's a blind spot large enough for a strike team to reach your bedroom without tripping a single laser." She looked up at him. Her wide eyes reflected the blue light of the monitors. For the first time, she saw a flicker of genuine shock cross his face, followed by a terrifying, cold realization. "You weren't just hunted, Ji-hoon. You're being harvested." Ji-hoon leaned over the desk, his face inches from hers. The scent of sandalwood and danger was overwhelming. "And why are you telling me this? You could have used this to slip out. You could have left me to die."
Imani didn't blink. The girl who followed the rules was gone, replaced by a woman who realized that in this world, knowledge was the only currency that bought air. Because I don't want to be a removed variable, I want to be the person who redesigns your survival. My life for your house, Ji-hoon. Fix the blueprints or lose everything. Ji-hoon stared at her for a slow beat, then a slow, predatory smile touched his lips. It seems I didn't just pick up a passenger, I picked up an architect. The adrenaline that had sustained Imani through the car chase and the confrontation with the elders finally began to bleed away, replaced by a cold, bone-deep ache. Ji-hoon led her away from the monitors and into a small, secluded medical suite he called the Blue Room. The walls were a deep midnight sapphire, lit by soft recessed lights that made the space feel underwater, removed from the violence of the world outside.
"Sit," he commanded, though the edge in his voice had softened to a low rumble. Imani sank onto the edge of a leather exam table, the movement causing a sharp hiss of pain to escape her lips. She hadn't noticed until now that a shard of glass from the bridge ambush had sliced a deep line across her shoulder, the dark maroon of her dress hiding the bloom of blood. Ji-hoon returned with a basin of warm water and a first aid kit. He didn't call for a doctor. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man used to tending his own wounds. He stood between her knees, his presence overwhelming in the small room. With a steady hand, he reached for the delicate beaded strap of her dress. Imani stiffened, her breath catching. "I can do it," she whispered. "You can't reach it," he countered, his eyes meeting hers. For a second, the predatory mask slipped, revealing a weariness that matched her own. "Hold still, Imani."
As he gently moved the fabric aside, his fingers brushed against her skin, warm, calloused, and unexpectedly careful. He began to dab away the dried blood with a soft cloth. The sting of the antiseptic made her flinch, and instinctively her hand reached out, gripping his forearm for support. Under the fine silk of his shirt, his muscles were like iron, but he didn't pull away. "The elders, they really would have killed me," she murmured, watching the way the blue light caught the sharp line of his jaw. "In this world, anything that isn't an asset is a threat," Ji-hoon said, his focus entirely on the wound. He picked up a pair of tweezers, his movements surgical as he extracted a tiny glint of glass. "You're no longer a threat, and you're becoming much more than a passenger." He looked up, and for the first time the distance between them vanished. In the quiet of the Blue Room, he wasn't the monster who ran the city, he was just a man holding her together. He leaned in, his thumb tracing the curve of her collarbone just below the bandage he had placed. The air between them thickened, charged with a tension that was far more dangerous than the shootout on the bridge. "You have a builder's heart, Imani," he said softly, his gaze dropping to her lips. "You see the cracks before the building falls. Stay close to me, and I'll make sure you're the one who survives to see the new world." He stepped back then, the wall of professional coldness snapping back into place, but the ghost of his touch remained burning against her skin long after he left her alone in the blue light. The silence of the estate was a lie. To anyone else, the long moonlit corridor leading away from the medical suite looked like a path to safety, but Imani saw the truth in the architecture. She knew the rhythm of the security sweeps now, the way the infrared beams cut through the air at groin level every 45 seconds, and the hidden pressure sensors disguised as decorative floor molding. She moved with a ghost's grace, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. She had discarded her heels and the ruined beaded sleeves of her dress, leaving her in a sleek, blood-stained silhouette that blended into the shadows. Her architect's mind was a live map, tracing the ventilation shaft she had identified in the blueprints. It was a narrow, cramped passage that bypassed the central gate's biometric locks, leading directly to the service perimeter, where the forest met the fence. She reached the utility closet, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. With a steady hand, she unscrewed the vent cover, her fingers moving with a precision she didn't know she possessed. She began to climb,
the cold metal of the ductwork pressing against her skin. This was her exit. Beyond these walls lay the life she knew, the office, the safety of the rules, the anonymity of being invisible. But as she reached the junction above the main foyer, she stopped.
Through the slats of the ventilation grill, she looked down into the darkness of the hall below. A shadow moved, silent, fluid, and wrong. It wasn't the heavy, rhythmic step of the syndicate guards. This figure moved with a lethal efficiency, draped in matte black, a suppressed pistol held in a low-ready position. The intruder wasn't heading for the exit. He was moving toward the blue room, toward Ji-hoon. Imani's grip on the metal duct tightened until her knuckles turned white. She was inches from the service hatch, inches from freedom. If she left now, she would be back in her apartment by dawn, another face in the New York crowd. But she looked at the assassin again, realizing that he was using the very blind spot she had pointed out to Ji-hoon, the structural flaw that made this house a kill box. If Ji-hoon died tonight, the perfection of her old life would be a lie built on the bones of a man who had, for one brief moment in a blue-lit room, seen her as something more than a variable. The good girl who followed the rules would have run, but the woman who redesigned the blueprints for survival couldn't move. The choice wasn't about logic anymore. It was about the structure of her own soul. With a silent, shaking breath, Imani turned away from the exit. She didn't head for the woods. She began to crawl back toward the heart of the fortress, toward the man she was supposed to fear, and the only person who made her feel truly alive. The heavy, reinforced steel door hissed shut, sealing them into a space no larger than a service elevator. The air in the safe room was sterile and recycled, tasting of ozone and cold metal. Outside, the muffled percussion of gunfire and the frantic shouting of the park syndicate guards echoed through the vents, but inside the 4x4 square, the world had shrunk down to 2 people and the suffocating heat of their own adrenaline. Ji-hoon slumped against the back wall, his chest heaving, his dark suit jacket discarded to reveal a shirt drenched in sweat and blood. Imani sat opposite him, her knees pulled to her chest, her torn maroon dress spilling around her like a dark, bruised flower. For the first hour they said nothing. The only sound was the low hum of the oxygen scrubber and the frantic rhythm of their breathing. "You could have left," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, raspy friction in the tiny space. He didn't look at her. He was staring at the reinforced ceiling. "I saw you at the vent. You had the hatch open. Why did you come back?" Imani leaned her head back against the cold steel, her eyes closed. "Because your house is built on a lie, Ji-hoon, and I'm an architect. I couldn't let the structure fail just because the builder was a traitor." She opened her eyes, finding his gaze in the dim red emergency lighting. "And because I spent my whole life being the good girl who walked away when things got messy. I didn't want to be invisible anymore. Not to you." The silence that followed was different, heavy with a tension that had nothing to do with the assassins outside. Ji-hoon shifted, his shoulder brushing against hers in the cramped quarters. The proximity was electric. In the silence, she could hear the steady, heavy thrum of his heart. "You're not invisible, Imani," he whispered. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly as he tucked a stray, beaded braid behind her ear. His touch was no longer the clinical care of a captor. It was the reverence of a man seeing something for the first time. "In that car, on the bridge, you were the only thing I could see." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of sandalwood and gunpowder was intoxicating in the small room. Imani didn't pull away. She reached up, her fingers tracing the sharp, tired line of his jaw, grounding him. When he kissed her, it wasn't a gentle thing. It was a desperate, starving collision, a release of all the terror and high-stakes pressure of the last 6 hours.
In the dark, safe room's silence, the architect and the monster finally stopped fighting the world and started clinging to each other, two broken structures finding a new foundation in the middle of a war. The air in the grand study was thick with the scent of ozone and the heavy, lingering vibration of the mansion's lockdown sirens. Ji-hoon stood at the head of the mahogany table, his silhouette dark and immovable, while the three elders watched from the shadows, their expressions a mix of suspicion and poorly veiled contempt. They had survived the night, but the house felt fractured, its sense of safety permanently shattered. Imani stepped forward into the pool of light cast by the overhead chandelier, her bare feet silent on the floor. She no longer looked like the trembling passenger from the bridge. Though her maroon dress was stained with oil and blood, her eyes were sharp, carrying the clarity of someone who had survived the dark. In her hand she held a tablet synced to the house's core server. The attack tonight wasn't a failure of your men, it was a success of the architecture.
She swiped the screen, projecting a 3D overlay of the estate onto the wall. A series of red lines pulsed near the library and the safe room. I told you the blueprints were altered, but I didn't tell you how. The ventilation shaft I used wasn't just a blind spot. It was a calibrated acoustic tunnel. Someone didn't just leak the codes. They ensured that when the harmonic pulse hit the windows, the security sensors would interpret the vibration as a system test, not a breach. She looked directly at the youngest elder, Min-ho, whose hands were folded too neatly on the table. You oversaw the final phase of the North Wing renovation. You signed off on the accidental change to the glass density. You didn't just open the door for the Valente hit squad, you designed the house to invite them in. The room went cold. Min-ho let out a dry, dismissive laugh. This is the rambling of a terrified girl who spent too much time in a dark room. You're going to take the word of a witness over a loyal member of this family?
It's not my word, Imani countered, her fingers flying across the screen. It's the digital signature. Every structural change requires an encrypted authorization. You thought you wiped the logs, but as an architect, I know that every change leaves a ghost in the load-bearing calculations. You authorized the thinning of the safe room's outer wall 3 weeks ago. You didn't want the hit squad to just find ji-hoon. You wanted them to be able to shoot through the very room meant to save him. Ji-hoon moved with the speed of a predator that had finally found its mark. He didn't reach for a weapon. He simply stepped into Min-ho's space, his gaze dropping to the elder's trembling hands. The betrayal wasn't a theory anymore. It was a structural fact, proven by the woman who saw the world in lines and logic. "The blueprints don't lie, Min-ho," ji-hoon whispered, his voice a low, terrifying rumble. "And neither does she." Imani watched as the guards moved in, her heart hammering not with fear, but with a cold, newfound power. She wasn't just a guest or a prisoner. She was the only person in the room who truly knew the shape of the house they were standing in. The first light of a new dawn bled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the estate, turning the cold limestone into a soft, burning gold. Outside, the sirens had finally faded, replaced by the rhythmic sound of workers clearing the shattered glass from the driveway. The kill box was being dismantled, and in its place a new structure was rising, one built on truth rather than treachery. Imani stood in the center of the master suite, staring at her reflection in a floor-length mirror. She had finally shed the ruined maroon dress, replacing it with a tailored black suit provided by the estate staff. Her beaded braids were pulled back, tight and professional, and her makeup was precise, a mask of calm authority that didn't hide the woman underneath, but honored her. She looked at her phone, which was finally charged and buzzing with frantic notifications from her firm, her friends, and her old life.
With a steady hand, she swiped the screen and hit power off. That version of Imani Johnson, the invisible architect who followed everyone else's blueprints, was a ghost. A heavy knock sounded at the door, and ji-hoon entered.
He had changed into a fresh shirt, but he still carried the scent of the night's fire and the safe room's intimacy. He stopped behind her, his eyes meeting hers in the glass. He didn't ask if she was ready to go home. He didn't offer her a car to the Heights. He simply held out a hand, his fingers waiting for hers. "The elders are waiting in the dining hall," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, steady anchor. "They want to discuss the reconstruction of the syndicate's assets, and they want to know who is going to oversee the new security protocols." Imani turned, her hand sliding into his, her palm pressing against his calloused skin. The connection was no longer a desperate tether for survival. It was a partnership. "Tell them the architect is here," she said. They walked down the grand staircase together, their footsteps echoing in perfect unison against the marble. When they entered the dining hall, the remaining elders rose from their seats. At the head of the long obsidian table, 2 chairs had been set side by side. Ji-hoon didn't sit first. He waited, pulling out the chair to his right for her. As Imani took her seat, she looked down the length of the table at the men who had once discussed her removal. They didn't look at her with contempt anymore. They looked at her with the wary respect reserved for a person who knows exactly where the foundations are buried. Ji-hoon sat beside her, his hand covering hers on the table. He looked out at his empire, then turned to her with a ghost of a smile. "Welcome home, Imani." She didn't look back at the iron gates. She looked at the blueprints spread across the table and began to redraw the world.